Start now.
Start.
So welcome to Angel Investment for Startups. My name is Suraya Turk. I'll be hosting the session today. Thank you for those who are joining in. I can see that there's a number of participants joining in as I speak. And I'll give just a few moments because we are expecting a large number today, which is really exciting. So just I'll let them roll in as we speak and we'll get started in just a few minutes. So just as some housekeeping today, I expect that the presentation will go on for approximately round about an hour, maybe a little bit less. I'll do my best to run through as much as I can today, under an hour, and then allow some opportunity towards the end to for the participants to ask some questions. So if you can hear me, hopefully nice and clearly, you will have a chance to ask some questions today. So you just need to keep those in the chat box. And when I have the chance, either throughout the presentation or towards the end, I will do my best to answer most of those. And of course, if I don't answer all the questions today on the session, feel free to reach out at a later stage and set up a consultation. All right, excellent. So I can see lots of people have joined, which is really fantastic. And we're right on time. I'll give it just another couple of seconds and I think we will get going. Excellent. So welcome to Angel Investment for Startups. Today, this presentation is hosted by Legal Circle and Emirates Angels Investor Association. Excellent. So without further ado, let's get started. So first, I wanted to begin this presentation by thanking Emirates Angel Investors for hosting and partnering with Legal Circle today to bring this fantastic presentation. I hope you enjoy it and find it as beneficial for you as possible. So just a little bit about Emirates Angels. Firstly, I might just put on the next slide, is Emirates Angels' objective is to accelerate the startup ecosystem, and they focus on educating angel investors and entrepreneurs. And their mission is to connect investors and startups in the region, and so far they've been very active in the region. They have lots of activities, and on the previous slide I showed there is a number of ways that you can download on an Android or on Huawei or Apple, their app store. So please do that to know more about and keep up to date with Emirates Angel Investors. Legal Circle is an upcoming and hopefully disruptive legal marketplace. That's our mission, really, to disrupt the marketplace in the commercial legal industry through innovative business models and custom-built technology to be able to provide efficient, high-quality and cost-effective services to our clients. Today, my name is Suraya Turk and I will be hosting the presentation. I'm the managing partner of Legal Circle and based in the UAE. And today this session is brought to you from Dubai. So without further ado, I'd like to start the presentation today with some of the most common mistakes we see startups making in the fundraising space. So if you are making some of these mistakes, what I'd like you to do is put in the chat box for us, because I want this to be as interactive as we possibly can over a webinar. But what I'd like you to do is put the number of the mistake that you feel that you've either made or concerned about making in the chat box. And that way we get to see, and I will try to address some of those issues and will address most of those in the presentation. So if you're making any of these mistakes or are concerned about these mistakes, know that most startups we work with have fallen into this trap before. So the first one is, are you desperate to raise funds that you take money from anyone who will give it to you? Now, the reason why we've identified this as a mistake in fundraising is because shortly we will discuss how fundraising works. and what happens when you raise funds from a shareholder and the effect that it has on the existing shareholders in the company. So if you're raising funds from anyone who will give it to you, you need to know that they will be shareholders in your company. And if you're not happy about who they are and they don't add much value, then it's a little bit of a mistake to take money from somebody you don't understand what value they can add. Raising too much early on. So number two, lots of startups get really carried away with fundraising and not really doing their homework beforehand. And so what they do is they raise more than what they actually need. And again, this results in dilution of shareholders and shareholding. Three is a common mistake, and it's making a mess of the cap table and not having one at all. So we'll talk a little bit more about what cap table is and what information needs to go on there and how it needs to be recorded in due course in this presentation. But that's one of the common mistakes as well made by startups who are fundraising. Fourthly, giving out fundraising notes without considering the impact of those. So what we've seen in the market is that lots of startups can, go to a website, whether it's Y Combinator or other websites, and download, a bunch of safe notes and convertible notes, and they start handing those out like they're chips to lots of investors, and they get signatures on lots of them, and they're really excited about fundraising, but they don't understand the impact of those notes and how they interact and convert at a later stage. And five, giving up too much control of the company because you don't understand the impact of certain investor clauses. And when I say certain investor clauses, if you're in the process of negotiating with any investors, often they will have lots of demands to be either on the board or to have voting rights, to make decisions on the operational requirements of the company. And in that case, if you do give those rights, you can compromise on the control that you have. So if I've not mentioned any of the mistakes here that you feel that you've made or worried about making, please type in the chat box and let me know what other mistakes you're concerned about or perhaps made that I've not mentioned here. So today the presentation is going to not focus on the mistakes, but focus on what you can proactively do and what information you need to know to equip yourselves to manage these. Excellent. So let's move on to the next one. So really quickly, I just want to go through an agenda so that you know what I'm covering today. Part one is just going to be a summary of what an angel investor is. This might be common to a lot of you on the presentation today. However, we've got so many people at different stages in their journey. And so it will be an idea just to give a quick summary. So what is an angel investor? Why choose an angel investor, what to look for, some do's and don'ts, and where to find them. Part two is where we get down to business and we talk about incorporation and incorporating a company, understanding the fundraising process and where angel investment is typically expected and seen in that process, the impact of fundraising instruments. We'll look at the legal documents as part of your startup toolkit, and then how to become investor ready. And at the end of the presentation as well, today we have a nice offering for everybody who's joined us as a one-time only to continue forward from this presentation. So let me start with angel investors. All right. So I assume that most of you know this already, but who is an angel investor? So an angel investor is typically a high net worth individual who invests into startup companies. Sometimes they're serial investors, which means they do this not as a hobby, but they do this very often, that they become so knowledgeable in the fundraising process and with particular startups. And then other times they're new to the game and are just interested in making some return on their investment. Now, there are different angel investors, of course, and we always recommend that as a startup, you are always considering the value add of that angel investor. So what can that investor add? How does that investor add value? It's not just about raising funds, but it's about smart money. It's about, can that angel investor connect you within his network? Can he introduce you and establish relationships for you that you need going forward in the fundraising round? It's about what industry knowledge that investor has. Angel investors sometimes are very specific and in particular industries, and they invest in those. So that would add value to you if you're in a particular industry. The growth, how will that angel investor support you to grow the company and to scale? So what I'd like you to do is, if there's anybody on this presentation who's in current negotiations with angel investors, please let me know. You simply need to insert yes, or Y for yes, or N for no. Excellent. So some do's and don'ts when it comes to angel investors. What you always want to be thinking is of the future. You want to hope for the best, but you need to plan for the worst. And the way to do this is to ensure that you have the right partners or the right angel investors in this particular scenario in your company. So you always want to be thinking ahead. You want to be thinking, how does this right partner or how does this angel investor add value? How is this person going to be seen on my cap table? And we'll go into what a cap table is in due course, as I said, but very briefly, a cap table is a spreadsheet which records all of the shareholders and the dilution over time in the fundraising. So the question that you really should be asking yourself as a startup is, if I have this particular person or angel investor on my cap table, how will they be seen by future investors in the future round where I'm going to be raising more money? You also want to test the relationship with the angel investor before you take an investment. Will they deliver on what they say they will? Do you want to work with this, either a particular individual or if it's an organization as a pool of angel investors? These are the questions you really need to ask yourself. It's about smart money, not just money for the sake of money. The don'ts are not to give away too much. So one thing we hate seeing, and we've seen often, is first-time founders get so desperate to attract these investors that they often give away too much of their company in the very early stages, or they agree to unfavorable and unusual terms because they're so worried about losing an offer. Again, what you need to be keeping in mind is that this can distort your cap table and make you less desirable in the future rounds to other larger investors or institutional investors. So just as a quick tip, we would recommend never to give away half of your company in the seed rounds. In the early stages, it's typical to raise funds and to dilute by about 10 to 25%. So that would be within the normal range. All right, so we move to where you can find angel investors in the region. There's lots of angel investment networks and organizations in the UAE. So we've got Emirates and Angels, for example, our partner today on this very presentation. There's Womena, which is a women's angel investment platform, Dubai Angel Investors as well, just to name a few. There's lots of incubators and hubs in the UAE, from FinTech Hive to Hub 71, Startup Bootcamp, Sharat and Sharjah, and In5. LinkedIn and networking. So some of the platforms we've listed here is Magnet, Crunchbase, and F6S. But essentially, to attract an angel investor is you need to talk about what you're doing and to go out and to network in as many spaces as what you can to get your idea or your product or your prototype, as visible to people who, and in an environment where there are lots of investors. And, at the moment, Dubai is such a hub, and there are so many angel investors looking to make some good investments in fantastic startups that we see in the region. Okay, so the next slide, we get down to business. So a quick.
Let's get down to business.
Excellent. All right. So to get down to business, we're going to be talking about incorporation and the corporate structure and understanding the fundraising process. So let me just play that again. Excellent. So first and foremost, any startup, so if you've joined this, you probably have already, and if you haven't and are just about to embark on the startup journey, the first process is really to set up and incorporate. And so typically what we see is that, startups will start with an operational entity, and rightly so, because that's the license that you need to do any business in the UAE. But what I'd like to talk about today is post the operational entity, because we're really talking about fundraising, and it's important to have a corporate structure in place that will support the fundraise process. Many startups already know this, and it's a question of timing about when they do it. So it's chicken and egg, because generally they want to raise funds before they go off and set up another entity. But I think for the moment, what I wanted to get across was the importance of having an SPV at some stage, and if possible, very early on. And an SPV, for those who don't know what it is a special purpose vehicle, or otherwise known as a holding company. Now, the purpose of the SPV or holding company is exactly that, to hold the entities, in particular operational entities, and they house and hold the investors and the founders. And the reason for doing so is to keep the fundraisers and the investors arm's length from the operational company. One, to protect the investors, to protect your IP and your asset, but also to make the operations a lot more seamless and smooth, and not let the fundraising process and the administration around all of that affect the day-to-day operations. And of course, mitigating risk. So if there are any liabilities on the operational level, it doesn't affect the investors or the founders who sit in the SPV. And of course, it helps you to expand across the markets, because that one SPV or holding company can own multiple subsidiaries under it as well. So one of the things I wanted to point out whilst we're on this slide is always to consider having and incorporating the holding or SPV in a common law jurisdiction. So whether that's the ADGM, BVI, or Cayman Island. And the reason for it is obviously because, and of course DIFC, sorry, I forgot to mention that, but of course DIFC as well. And the reason, and what they all have in common, is that it's common law jurisdiction. So it's really important to note that the fundraising process and the instruments or the documents that we use in the fundraising process are all based on common law principles. And so for those documents to be enforceable, they will be enforceable in a common law jurisdiction, and those documents will be part of your SPV or your holding. So it's very important to be aware of that when you are planning and when you are thinking about your corporate structure. And just a quick additional note in terms of cost, because that's usually always a consideration that startups have, but the costs are not huge, and they're quite streamlined, and there's lots of corporate service providers who can do this at an affordable and quick and easy, it's a quick and easy process. Excellent. So I can see lots of questions or comments coming through. I'm just going to have a look at those. Okay. Excellent. So I'll come back to some of those. And I just mentioned, because I can see Ali Khawaja has asked, where to set up an SPV. So really quickly, again, ADGM, DIFC, Cayman, or BVI are the most common ones. All right, so let's get to understanding the funding process. So now we can, safely say you have your operational entity incorporated in either a free zone or mainland or any jurisdiction in the UAE. And then above that, you have your SPV. And now you're ready to start the fundraising or the fund process. So lots of startups ask us, what are the stages of fundraising? I mean, where does it start? Where does it end? And how does it work? So essentially, you can start to fundraise small amounts of money just to kick off your idea in the idea stage. And this is a pre-seed, commonly known as a pre-seed stage, where you raise small amounts of money from family and friends. Once you've done that and you've deployed all of the investment money, it moves over to a seed round. Now, the seed round is really not the formal, or it's considered to be a formal funding round. And this is typically where your angel investors will invest in a startup. So this is typically where we see angel investors, and this is so that now it's perhaps you'll use the money to expand the team, perhaps to now buy some more equipment if you're in a specific industry which requires that, and really to just kick off and start to build up your concept and idea. So the next stage after seed is Series A. Now this is a more formal round again. It's an early stage round where you start to look at institutional investors, so venture capital. And this is where you really want to launch the product. You now have a bigger team. Perhaps you want to create a branch. You like to expand your offerings and really proof your concept. And you've got something to show for at this stage. Then we go to the Series B, where now we're looking at more of the growth stage. Again, your VCs and institutional investors were more likely to invest. And you're going to be very focused on growth and scaling of the company in this round. And then there is Series C and further, which is a continuation of Series B. And it's really helping you to expand your presence across the region, globally, really go to market, generate revenues, and not kickstart, because you've hopefully already done that, but this is at this stage you're really showing some traction and a very viable business model. So that's just a little bit about the fundraising process, and we'll talk again in the coming slides about how that works. So what I want to do now is just address some common questions that we often get asked by our startups. So the first one is, how do you determine how much money you should raise? So this is a common question that we get asked, and it's interesting because it's a very subjective one. So this is really dependent on what your expenses are and what your plans are for expansion, operation, and what are the growth costs. So when you determine how much money you'd like to raise, you really need to be modeling out what you need to get to your next milestone. You need to be thinking of, what do we need, or how much do we need to deploy to reach a certain number of users, perhaps generate a certain number of revenues per month, or break even. So this is where you're doing your financial modeling to see what it is that you need at every stage to get you going and to build some traction. Often we're asked about the fundraising process and whether it's a linear one. Yes, so in response to this question, it is linear. As you saw on the previous slide, where you have Series A and you move to seed before, pre-seed before you move to seed, and then Series A, etc. But the process can be quite fluid. So for example, if you are not a first-time startup and perhaps you've set up multiple successful startups previously, you might jump straight into existing investors that you already have an established relationship with, and they may give you quite significant amounts of money. So it's quite fluid in terms of who you might be approaching in your first stages. But generally, most of the startups we work with, and particularly in the region, do start small with angel investors and then progress as they need to. So the next most common question is, how do the rounds open and close? When you have raised money, you set out to raise, effectively that round will close. And the indicator we use is the value of your company. So if you set out to raise $2 million pre-series or in your seed stage, once you've raised that, you can then close that round. Once you've deployed those funds, and now you need more to get to the next stage of either growth or scaling or hiring more employees or expanding across markets, and you need more money, then you would open a new round and introduce or invite bigger investors with bigger money to invest in the company. Okay, so when should you plan for your next raise? That's another question we get asked all the time. And again, this is a very subjective one. So it all depends on what the need of the company is. What is your strategy? What is your business plan? What are you planning to do 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 5 years from now? Where would you like to be? And how much funds do you need to make that happen? And that's the questions that you need to ask yourself to essentially plan for your future fundraising and be aware of how much you need to raise. If you've got any questions on this, please do type your questions into the chat box, and I'll get to them if I haven't already answered the question. Excellent. So we've just talked about fundraising, we've looked at the process, we've looked at some common questions. Now, what is the impact? And I feel often when we're speaking to startups that they're so focused on raising money that they can forget to consider what who's come up or development. You don't want to be watered down. You don't want to be diluted so much so that you only have a small piece of the pie or slice of the pie, which is a shareholding in your own company. And we do see startups have made this mistake before. So one specific startup we're advising had given about 60% of their company in the seed stage only. Which is not ideal. As I mentioned earlier, very on 10 to 25 in the seed stage is quite common. More than that, you really need to be looking at, who it is that you're speaking to and bringing on in the early stages as investors. And you need to understand that the impact is that every time you raise new funds, you're promising that investor to either give them shareholding now or in the future. And so therefore, you will be essentially diluting the existing shareholders in the company. And earlier on in the presentation, I talked a lot about what a cap table is, and I said many mistakes, many startups have made the mistake of not having a cap table. And we're going to go into that in a minute because a cap table is so very important for a startup. If you are raising funds, you need to record in a spreadsheet, which is effectively your cap table, what are the percentages or shares that you're parting with for investors in each of the rounds. So you need to be able to see, as you're going through the fundraising process, how much you're being diluted and how much shares you're giving away to investors. Oops, sorry, my slide. Okay. Excellent. So what we've done here is I've just given an example. So this is, the figures are not accurate. This is a disclaimer. Please don't take down any of these figures or have a look at them. And I'm not showing you in this cap table how any of the calculations have been made, but this is used just for reference only and to see what information a cap table actually captures. So you have your founders, you have your shareholders, any discount prices, the number of shares that you've issued, the investment value, and the current share price. So generally with startups and the ones that start to have some serious cap table and lots of investors on the cap table will have their accountants in-house or external prepare this for them. The key takeaway is just that you need to have this and you need to be able to see how you are diluting the existing shareholders, and your investors in future rounds will definitely ask to see this. So let's look at the fundraising instruments. In the fundraising rounds, there are different documents and legal contracts that you will use, and they have a different impact. So the most common ones in the region is the safe and convertible note. These are two ways of essentially inviting investors to invest and give you money for a promise of future shares in the company. So a safe note, which most of you are probably already aware of, stands for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. And this note is in exchange for cash that the investor receives as a contractual future right to buy equity when equity funding round takes place. Alternatively, there is a convertible note, and a convertible note is a debt instrument or a loan works similar to the safe note, but has a debt element. So it's made to a startup by an investor, and which converts to equity at a predetermined trigger event or a maturity date. And since it's a debt instrument, it does have priority for repayment if a startup fails before the note actually converts. You always need to be considering that element and understanding the impact of a convertible note versus a safe note. Typically, though, we do see safe notes being issued a lot more in the region than we do convertibles, but of course they're also given. An equity financing round, as opposed to seed stage, where you might give the safe or convertible note, is where you issue shares directly in the startup in exchange for cash. So it's not a promise for a future equity, but rather a straight exchange of shares for equity, where the shares have a predetermined price and a number of shares, and the investor is given a subscription agreement followed by a shareholder agreement. And we'll talk about some of these notes in more detail going forward. What I'd like to do, though, is ask all the participants a question. If you are fundraising and have used either of those documents, so safe or a convertible, please type Y for yes and N for no, or let me know which one you've used or currently negotiating, perhaps. Excellent. Let me just have a quick look at. Excellent, great. So I can see lots of people are using safe notes, which is very in line with the experience that we have with startups. Excellent. So let's look at the advantages of a safe note versus a convertible note. So if you're using a safe note now, you might be reassured, because whilst they both have advantages and disadvantages, the advantage of raising through a safe as opposed to convertible note are several. So the first thing is that safes don't have a specific term. So they're not triggered, which means that if there's a trigger event never occurs, an investor will not receive shares. Now, keep in mind that an investor may want to see a deadline and a timeline in the safe. So it's not a rule of thumb, but generally they don't have a term. In a safe note, interest is not payable. So the complexities of working out the interest is not involved in the safe note process. And it's purely because a safe note is not a debt, whereas a convertible note is a debt instrument. And then, because safe notes are becoming very popular, lots of angel investors are very familiar with those terms, and it's a lot more easier to negotiate those. It's not saying that convertible note doesn't have a place in the process, particularly in the seed stages, but we do see safe notes much more commonly used. Okay, so if we look at the key terms of a convertible note and a safe note, and again, we see a lot of confusion and misunderstanding around these terms in a safe and a convertible. And the first one is pre and post money value. So what is a pre and what is a post money value? On the most basic level, and a basic definition is that a pre money value is the value of the company before it receives the investment from a round of financing, as opposed to post money value, which is the value of the company after the investment. Now, it's very important to have either pre or post money value, because these determine the conversion of shares or what the value of shares will be in the future rounds. There's also the discount rate. So discount rate is commonly and always found in your safe or convertibles. And the discount rate is when you offer an investor a discount on the value of the future price of the share. I can see some people are raising their hands. So what I'm going to do is ask those people who are raising their hands to ask a question to please put the question into the chat box, and I will come to those very shortly. So a discount rate, when you offer an investor a discount, you're offering him a discount on the value of the future price of the share. And it's usually given to investors in the early stages of funding to add more value so they get more for less in the future rounds when they convert. The difference here as well is a case of semantics, and often people think the discount rate is the same as the discount percent, but it's very important to make sure that the language used on the SAFE or the convertible notes is clear to your investor and clear to you to understand what the impact of the discount rate is. So often, more than not, we see a discount rate of 80%, but how that translates is that the discount on the value of the share is a discount of effective 20%. And many times startups get very confused about that definition and what the actual calculation is. So you need to be aware of what language is used on the SAFE or convertible note. Valuation cap, so that's another term that we see on the convertible notes and SAFE. Essentially, the definition of a valuation cap is what is the ultimate value of the company estimated at. And when you cap it, it's so the conversion is, there's a floor, which means that the conversion at the future equity round for a SAFE or convertible holder will convert on that particular valuation cap, even if the market value of the company is a lot higher. And again, the effect of this is so that the money that the early stage investor has invested goes a longer way and is more valuable and gives them more value for their money. So 4 common mistakes that we see on a SAFE or on convertibles. And again, I'd like you to tell me if you've made any of these by inserting the number 1, 2, 3, or 4 to let me know whether you've made any of these mistakes. Because again, this is something that we've commonly seen with startups in the region. So startups often just download a template. They don't understand the clauses necessarily, and they just fill in the blanks without understanding the impact of those clauses. So again, on the previous slide, I was talking about valuation caps or discount rounds, or whether to use the pre or post money value to determine the value of shares. These clauses all have an impact on the investor and on you as the founder. So you really want to be aware of what that impact is and be able to foresee and project and plan. So, if you don't specify pre or post money value, you're not determining the correct conversion depending on this valuation. You might incorrectly assume the discount rate is applied to the valuation cap. Again, this isn't how it works. The discount rate is applied to the value of shares, not the valuation cap overall. And another common mistake is incorrectly documenting the discount rate. So saying the discount rate is 20% as opposed to, for example, an 80% discount rate, which makes a difference on how to calculate conversion. Excellent. So if you've got questions on this, which generally startups do, please put those in and I can see those are coming through. So put your questions in the Q&A box and put any comments you have in the chat box so I can differentiate those. Thanks so much. Excellent. So we're ready to move on. Perfect. So what I'd like to do is a bit of a quick recap on the legal documents that are used in fundraising rounds, and which should be a part of your startup toolkit. Again, I can see somebody's raised their hand. Please put your question into the Q&A box in the Zoom. So you can see on the side there should be a Q&A. So what are the common legal documents and what should be in your toolkit of documents? So firstly, it's a term sheet. And what is a term sheet? It's a document that outlines all of the basic elements of your negotiating with an investor. So all of the very important terms that you and the investor will need to negotiate and to be very clear on and to understand the impact of. So prior to entering into any specific agreements, which are going to be binding and enforceable at a later stage, a term sheet can often be non-binding or is non-binding and drafts out very clearly all of the terms of negotiation. So your shareholder agreement, this is probably one of the most important documents for startups, and it's the Bible or the rule book that all of the shareholders agree to abide by as such. This is the agreement or the document that all the shareholders understand, how things are going to take place in the company. Who is the director? How will the decisions be made? Who will have the ultimate say on those decisions? What are the exit plans going to be? What are the shareholder rights and responsibilities and obligations? All of that is captured in your shareholder agreement. Subscription agreement. So the subscription agreement is very important. It comes into play in an equity financing round. So this is where an investor is going to receive shares direct for their investment into the company. So they're essentially subscribing to the company's shares. And you'll see that there will be a fixed price of shares, a fixed number of shares, as opposed to, say, a safe and a convertible, where it's a future promise for shares. So your subscription agreement is where your investor subscribes to the company, and a subscription agreement, the parties to that will be your investors, the founders, and the company, as opposed to the shareholder agreement, where all of the shareholders in the company will be a part of. IP assignment agreement. I have IP assignment agreement here because I think it's very important to note that, and I should have probably spoken about this on the slide where we looked at the incorporation and the corporate structure. But as IP assignment agreement is really important, where sometimes and typically what we see in the region is that the founder has the trademark in his or her name or under the operational company. Now, if you're going to be setting up an SPV or a holding company, that should own the IP. So an IP assignment is useful here because that will transfer your IP assignment agreement to the SPV or the holding company, which has the investor sitting in. So that's why I've put this IP assignment agreement in the startup toolkit. Employment contracts, because they're absolutely necessary with all of your employees, and also your founders, investors, and particularly ones at later stages will want to see that the founders are also employed in the company. And of course, the SAFE and the C note, which we've talked about, and I think in a little bit more detail in this presentation already today. So it's not necessary to go into that, but if you've got any questions, please put those in the Q&A again. So these are the basic legal documents in the fundraising rounds. And now let's get ready. So how to become investor ready. You've just heard so much about the fundraising process. You've heard so much about how to structure yourself. You've heard a lot about the different notes and the mechanism and how that works and dilution. But how do you become investor ready? Well, first thing is start your business. If you've not already started, start. And then bootstrap in the very, very early stages. Bootstrap, do as much as you can with as little as you can. Because what you need to understand, particularly investors in the market, is that if you're not ready to back your idea, then why should an investor be? So show them your ability, show them how far you're prepared to go to back your idea, and to really show them that this is an idea worth investing in. So develop a pitch deck, showcase your concept and ideas in a pitch deck. Have a roadmap. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So do you have a roadmap for your business model? Do you have a contingency plan if you need to pivot your business? Because last year or when Corona hit, we saw that a lot of business models needed to change and needed to pivot to adjust to the changing environment. Remember, investors want to see a return on their investment, even if there are angel investors, and perhaps they're not investing huge amounts of money that a VC might be investing. Well, they still want to see a return on investment. So how do you intend to show them that return? Show them the numbers, show them the money. Understand your target investor too, because again, it's so important that there is a match between you, your company, what your business is, and that angel investor. Is he going to add value to your business? Is he going to be able to support you in the growth, introduce you to his networks, as we talked about earlier? Next point, which is so very important, is assessing how much money you actually need. Again, sometimes people ask for too much, sometimes they ask for too little. Of course, in your next funding rounds, you can anticipate that and work it into your business model, but only take as much as you need to deploy at that time, and then work your way up. Because remember, when you take somebody's money, you need to give them shares. And when you give shares, you're diluting your shareholding in the company. And last but not least, because I'm a lawyer and I have to say this, no, not because I have to, but for your own interest, have your legal documents ready. Have your startup toolkit there. Have the documents you need ready to rock and roll. Excellent. So that really takes us to the end of our session. What I wanted to do today, before going into how we can help you, is I'm going to have a quick look at the Q&A. I can see that we've got about 10 to 15 minutes. So before I wrap this up, let me go to the Q&As and see if I've not answered any of these questions. We can have a quick discussion on those now. And of course, you can always feel free to reach out to us after the webinar to set up a consultation and we can talk in more detail. But I have an anonymous attendee who asks, the startup should a finance manager to manage the fund, but his early stage, he won't be able to hire seniors. So what's the solution then? Well, there's so many resources out there available that have free templates or free cap table templates where you can go in and plug in some data just to give you a speculative idea of what the dilution might look like. So yes, it's understandable. You're not going to have a CFO from the get-go. You're not going to hire an accountant, but maybe full-time, but perhaps you hire him just on this one assignment, and to give you a cap table and to plug in that and to play around with numbers for you to make an executive decision. So to that anonymous attendee, there are lots of resources out there. We're happy as well if you reach out to us to give you a cap table with some of the formulas to have a play around with in your early stages as well. The next question we've been asked here is, the startup in his early journey doesn't have experience of negotiating, and who can assist? This is the importance of having people in your camp or on board with you, and particularly in the early stages, the angel investors who have experience, because they can help you negotiate these terms once they're on board as well with other investors. So if they've had this experience and they understand it, when you have them on board, they can support, and of course, legal support. So reaching out for legal support to understand what the dilution might look like. It's very important to understand this, and please don't underestimate it. What are the approximate costs we're looking at? So Mr. Ibrahim Asif, you've typed here, what are the approximate costs? I'm not sure whether that question was related to an SPV, but approximately you're looking at about $2,000 in the ADGM to set up an SPV. So if that question related to an SPV or a holding, it's approximately $2,000 US. Can you explain the pre-series round when it comes to pre? So I think I've already explained this, but just as a quick recap, remember the pre-series is your pre-formal rounds where there's small amounts of money from family or friends or angel investors to really kick off your idea. So I hope that's answered that. If you've got any other questions, please put those in the box. Another question, for how long do we have to determine the fund amount 2 or 3 years? So to that anonymous attendee, that's not how it works. So remember, if you recall in the early stage of the presentation, I said it's a subjective, very fluid process. Fundraising comes down to you, your ability to convince an investor that you're worth being invested in. And the amount that you set out to reach can happen as quickly or as slowly as you make it happen, and as quickly or as slowly as you convince that potential investor. It could be 6 months, it could be 12. But yeah, I've not seen them go for as long as 2 or 3 years, because most of the times it's in the startup's best interest to attract that investor and raise those funds quickly. So which one is in favor of a startup safe note or convertible? So that to the anonymous attendee who asked that question, I hope I already answered that. When we looked at the advantages of a safe note over a convertible, always remember the primary difference is that one has a debt element and the other doesn't. And one is bound by time and maturity date, whereas a safe note most often doesn't. Again, I hope that's answered your question. Okay, so again, we've asked how to depict the valuation. So I assume that question is asking, how do I value the company? Usually the value of the company in the early stages is very much speculative. It's very much an estimate of what you feel the value of your company has, as opposed to as you go through the funding rounds where you start attracting investors and you build traction and you grow the company. Now you can have an accountant who steps in to say, this is what the actual market value and price per share is. So Mohammed Al Musa asked, as a pre-revenue company, how can we determine the company valuation? So I've just answered that question. Again, that question is very much same as the other one. In the very, very early stages, it's an estimate. It's your best guess estimate based on your model, based on your projection of how well you think you're going to take off in the market, how much traction you've received so far. Okay. Maymuna Ramshed asked, how does an ESOP work for employees, and how do we differentiate? I believe the question is, how do we differentiate shares and equity provided to your investors and employees? So great question, Maymuna. And the way to differentiate it is on your cap table. So generally what you'll see on the cap table is your investors and the shareholding and the dilution, and you will see a pool that's been carved out, generally about up to 10% for your employees or your ESOPs, as Maymuna has rightly pointed out. And so you will see the dilution of the ESOP holders and investors on your cap table. That's why it's so important to have one. James asked, does an existing company qualify to get an angel investor for its startup business? So James, absolutely. If you're raising funds, you're going to raise, as we saw in this presentation, you're going to raise in the very early stages from family, friends, and most likely angel investors. Okay, so I can see that we've got 5 minutes and I still have lots of questions. I've answered most of those. So some of these we're going to have to take offline in about 10 minutes. But I can see that most of these I've probably already answered as well. And what I'd like you to do, just in case I'm not able to answer all your questions, and if there's a pressing one, please private in the chat box, send a private message with your name and your number. And within 2 hours of this presentation, a representative legal circle will contact you and personally answer the question for you. So please, in a private chat, send your name and your number and the question, and we will, within 2 hours of this presentation, give you a call back. So I've got a couple more minutes. I'm going to squeeze what I can into this. So there is one. Is there a one-shop stopping platform where ideas and owners and startups can deal with investors? Yes, Mr. Saeed, there's plenty in the market. There's a lot of B2B platforms. I think the best thing is to reach out to some of the angel investors and associations and networks. Reach out to Emirates Angels, see what they can do to help to bridge that gap for you and introduce you to investors, because that's exactly what Emirates Angels does. They introduce the angel investors together with the startups. They can host and organize some private sessions as well with pitching, etc. So there's lots out there. I mean, all you need to really do with that is even go onto Google and you'll find plenty of resources and platforms available to you there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is very quickly, I can see that there are lots of questions, but most of those we've answered. So again, if you've got a personal private question, if I've not answered it, please put your name and your number. What I want to do is today, before we wrap up, tell you how Legal Circle can help you. So you've heard so much information today, and I know it can be very, very overwhelming. And so what we're going to do today for today's attendees only is offer a very, very personalized startup subscription model for everybody on this session. So the fixed costs start from only $299 a month, and it gives you absolute unlimited legal support for all of your legal needs in the UAE. And I do say it starts at that price per month, and it does increase, and it does depend on your business and whether you're in fundraising rounds, and of course, the volume of work that you need and you require. But today only for the attendees on this, we are offering these extremely special rates. And so if you want to avail them, please put your name and your number, and within 2 hours of this presentation, we will give you a call and we will speak to you about this offer. As I said, it's really for the attendees only. It's only a very soft launch today. In the future, we'll have a lot more that we can offer to startups in the region. But we would love to hear from you and love to help you and support you on your journey. As I said, I've really got to wrap up because I have to keep this under 1 hour today. I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank all the participants again who have joined. I want to thank Emirates Angels for hosting this and for partnering with us and bringing education, quality education to the startup ecosystem. Thank you, Mr. Jassim, in particular from Emirates Angel, and of course, Emirates Angels. And once again, thank you to everybody who participated. Please do reach out to us. Keep your name and your number in the text box, and within 2 hours of this presentation, we will come back to you. And for excellent value, you can avail our subscription model today. So without further ado, I'd like to close this session. I look forward to seeing you at the next ones. We do have lots of sessions coming up. The next one will look at angel investment from an investor's perspective. So if you are an investor, please do tune in. Keep posted, download Emirates Angels app. Please follow also Legal Circle on Instagram and LinkedIn so that you can keep up to date with the information and upcoming presentations. Once again, thank you for having me. Thank you for joining, and I hope you received as much knowledge as you could from this session. Thank you so much.